You might remember the days when people kept their doors unlocked and enjoyed the peace and blissfulness of feeling safe and protected. Crimes like the one I'll be telling you today are why people now lock their doors and check them twice before going to bed. If you end up enjoying this video, please make sure to like and subscribe and click that little bell so we can enjoy our next story together. Now here's the story of the police officer turned killer. It all started in May of 1970 in Ontario, Canada, where an unexpected tragedy occurred. Meet the first victim, Doreen Morby. She used to be a nurse, but was a stay-at-home mom at the time to take care of her 2-year-old son. She was in a happy marriage, and that faithful day, as per usual, her husband left the house, giving her a kiss goodbye, and headed off to his job as a teacher. When he returned home, he will forever be traumatized by what he saw. His wife lay there in a puddle of her own blood and her son's legs pinned under her corpse. She was SA'd and shot 7 times. This was not only a terrible attack, but also a brutal one. It shocked the town, and the evidence shocked the police. There were no fingerprints, the bullet casings were nowhere to be found, there were no witnesses, and the gun that was used was rare, a .22 caliber non-shot revolver. The only evidence they had was the DNA left on the crime scene, but at the time, they could only use the DNA to find the blood type due to the technology limitations, making the whole case even more difficult to start solving. All they had was that the killer had a type A secretor blood type. The case was unsolved and labeled homicide number 3, as it was the third unsolved case of the year. They were able to get new information though, as 11 days later, a new murder occurred. Her name was Helen Ferguson. The wife was a nurse and the husband was a teacher, sharing the same professions as the original victims. They were a close family, and with her and her husband having 3 kids, she was a stay-at-home mom at the time, and when her oldest son Dale got ill, she stayed home to take care of him. Her son was laying on the couch on the main level resting when at some point during the day there was a knock on the door. So Helen got up and checked it, and when she returned in the house, a man followed behind her. She told her son that the man had a sick boy in the car and she was going to give him directions to the hospital. Dale looked back and saw the man for only a couple seconds before looking at the TV again. About an hour went by and Dale heard a loud bang. He immediately got up and ran to check on the noise, and he found his mother laying on the floor in a puddle of her blood, dead. The son called the police, but not before seeing his mother's killer leave the house and, in the process, wiping off the door handle he had touched. The same situation occurred, the same evidence and circumstances, but a pattern began to emerge, and it brought fear to all of those in Canada. He seemed to target women in secluded areas, one with kids, as one of the mothers was looking after her baby and the other her 8-year-old child who was sick at the time, in a pattern of striking every 11 days. Panic was like no other, and those who used to lend a helping hand and trusted to keep their doors unlocked refrained from that behavior. People were desperate for answers, and because Helen's 8-year-old son, Dale, was able to give people some of those answers. Dale gave a description of the man, and a sketch was made, and a description of his car being a beige 1964 Rambler was released. Investigators were getting up to 200 tips a day once the photo and descriptions were posted to the public. And through the blood types, they were able to narrow down the suspects. They were all over the case, interviewing over 2,000 people. Leads slowly dried up, though, as panic went down. The 11th day since the last killing came and went, and at this point, there were no more related murders. The public began forgetting about the whole incident, but not the families. Dale was truly traumatized, and he and his 2 younger siblings eventually moved away and were split up and sent to different homes. The fear was that the man who killed Dale's mother would then come after him because he was the only witness. Reasonably so, because the case went cold and no one was convicted. Until in September of 1973, when investigators got a promising lead. A landlady called in about a previous tenant she had. He owned a similar car to that of the wanted man, and he looked similar to the man as well. Her previous tenant was often described as being mentally ill, and he had a very violent side. He even drove around with a coffin in the back of his car. All these things made him a potential suspect. They were able to track him down in a mental hospital, and when tested, he had the same blood type as the killer. Everyone believed they got the man, but didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest, so the case went cold. The cold case was later re-examined in 1996. The detective that was put on this case was Don McNeil. Even though this case was really old, he was one of the only detectives still on the force with memory of the original attack. He had worked on it in 1970 when he was a young police officer. This was very lucky as he was able to make connections and find details that other detectives couldn't. So when he went through the original crime scene evidence, he found that the specimens were still intact, so they could be tested with the newer, more accurate technology. And finally, they could create a DNA profile. They used the profile to see if it matched with the man in the mental hospital or any of the other suspects, and none of them were a match. At this point, the case was almost 30 years old, so the likelihood of getting any new leads was slim to none, but a series of unlikely events unfolded. Elsewhere, police were tracking violent robberies, which would soon connect. Ed Pillerin was a detective assigned to a case of a couple robberies. Back on June 7th, 1995, a man came into a jewelry shop claiming to be purchasing a gift for his wife, and they took out a handgun, tied up the clerk, and went through the clerk's purse and stole some jewelry. Following this incident, a couple of days later, on June 16th, 1995, the same thing happened at another store, this time getting away with $30,000 worth of jewelry. This is when the killer's reign of crime started crumbling. First, the sketch that was made for the man who burglarized the jewelry stores was similar to that of the sketch made of the killer. A breakthrough finally came when one of the stolen rings turned up in a pawn shop. The pawn shop had cameras, and the man who pawned the jewelry used his real identification, showing up as Ronald Glenn West. He was swiftly apprehended, and when found, he still had the rope and latex gloves he had previously used. He was charged with multiple counts of burglary. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 8 years in jail. And for a while, this was it. After he was arrested, his house was put up for sale and was sold. The new couple that purchased the house did some major renovation, and when removing some of the ceiling boards, a couple of empty ring boxes fell out along with an envelope that contained 2 firearm permits dated back to 1968 and 1969. One of those permits was for a rare 9-shot 22 caliber pistol. This was noted by the police, but I assume there wasn't a lot of thought to it as the man had been caught and the significance was slim. But this is when things changed. Ed Pillerin happened to discuss the Ronald West file with Don McNeil, and this led to a connection. The rare firearm permits that were found in one case was the same used in a killing in a different case. Looking deeper, Ronald was employed as a Toronto police officer between 1966 and 1972, within the time frame of the killings. Not a lot of attention was on him though, because while on the force, he was known as a quiet guy and was an average officer. Nothing stuck out about him. His possible connections to the killings weren't too far-fetched despite his seemingly peaceful personality at the time, because he knew the area where the women were killed pretty well as he drove in them often, and he had purchased the gun and was an officer at the time of the killing. All this was enough to pursue an investigation, but not enough evidence to get a warrant for a blood sample. This would have helped immensely, as they could have compared it to the killer's DNA, which they still have from the 1970s. This hurdle wasn't too difficult to get over though, and this is all due to his wife. Once his wife found out about the burglaries, she wanted nothing to do with him. She was willing to give up anything she needed to help. While Ronald was in prison, he had mailed his wife a letter, and she gave the letter and the envelope from the letter to the police. They tested the stamp he had licked for DNA and were able to get a DNA profile. It was inconclusive, but it was enough to get an official blood warrant, and when tested, they got a conclusive match. The evidence didn't change Ronald's standpoint, though, as he continuously denied any involvement, even though the chances of the DNA matching someone else was 1 in 12 billion. Thanks to the work of Charlie Rossum so many years ago, The logs he preserved made it possible to use almost 3 decades later. And on August 25th, 1999, Ronald Glenn West was charged with 2 counts of murder, and he pled guilty to both of them. He refused to say what motivated the killings, and according to him, it was completely coincidental that the wives were both nurses and the husbands were both teachers, and they were both home with a child at the time. According to his statements, it was all random killings that happened to have a connection. During his trial, he faced the surviving family members of his victims, and he didn't show any remorse. He was sentenced to life in prison. Some justice was brought, but he had already gotten away with it for 30 years. To this day, people wonder how many victims were there and how many more murders weren't accounted for. I believe that considering the fact that he was able to get into the women's homes without forced entry, it's possible that he used his place as being a policeman to get in, maybe flashing his badge, which showed some more trust, or maybe he really did make up a lie and a story the entire time to convince these women to let him in. But what do you think happened? Make sure to be careful who you open the door for, and double check your locks before you go to sleep tonight. Please take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.